if you are a person who is used to doing those things, you could take it all on. After a while, don't care who you are, you're going to look at your partner and say, what do you do for our podcast? Or what do you do for this thing of ours? And why are you around if you don't do anything? Hey, what's up, creators? This is Andre from Just Start the Podcast, brought to you by A1 Podcasting and Content Creation. And today, I want to talk to you about building the right team. There I go, looking off into the stars again. I was talking to one of my friends today, and we're joining a mastermind. There you go. We're joining a mastermind, and it cost a little bit of money, but we get to be around people who are doing something in their space, and serious people, really. And I say all that to say, it got us to talking about me, him, and a couple of his friends, and what we all bring to the table individually, and why that was important to network with people with. And I started thinking well, that goes really the same in podcasting, is if you have the right team, or if you know how to spot who's right for your team, you can really be successful. And here's what I mean. As always, I pull from my own personal experience. When it comes to building a team for podcasting, it starts off very nonchalant. Okay, which means you have you, your buddy, and your buddy, or you and just your buddy. Alrighty. With that said, most of the time you're just grabbing your phone. When you're just starting, you're grabbing your phone and you're recording. If you want to take it a step further, you're grabbing a roadcaster and recording. Somebody then has to take that recording, clean it up, and upload it, whether they're responsible for sending it to the engineer, whether they're responsible for sending it to Fiverr for someone to upload to YouTube to do their thing. Somebody has to create the thumbnail. Somebody has to create the description. On your team, someone has to do all these things. If you are a person who is used to doing those things, you could take it all on. After a while, don't care who you are, you're going to look at your partner and say, what do you do for our podcast? Or what do you do for this thing of ours? And why are you around if you don't do anything? If that person is just there to be there, you're going to consider it to be your podcast alone. And if anything comes from it, you're probably going to want all the proceeds, because if that person is just showing up, then all they really deserve is a paycheck, not ownership. But once again, that's a whole nother topic within itself. No problems there. But to properly portion out or delegate, there we go, to properly delegate what goes where, you're going to need certain parts of your podcast to be kind of written in stone. I'll give you an example. So for my podcast, the Opinionated Podcast, I am the engineer. I am the, thumbnail designer. I do all the art. I do it because I like it. That's really what it was. It's that was a chance for me to be as creative as I can possibly be in that instance. I'm a guy who always did well at art. I did music before that. So when it came to theme music, I'm the guy that does theme music. I'm really, really interested, and I really study up on how to do these things properly, or at least to my liking. And I like to do it. You will not be so lucky with your talents, maybe. Everybody isn't in that position. So you have to tell somebody on your team, hey, you're in charge of finding a good audio engineer. You're in charge of staying up on that side of things. We just had a little snafu last week on the Opinionated Podcast where the wrong YouTube got put up. The wrong video got put up on our YouTube. And who's in charge of quality control to be able to look at that and say, Hey man, you put up the wrong one. Take that down and put up the other one. Or, you know what? Leave it up because it already got a certain amount of views. I'm in charge of that over there. Not by choice, but it's just the way the chips fell. So what I did was I just chose to leave it up. I chose to leave it up because it was already getting views. We're putting it up this week, like the actual audio up this week. Don't worry about it. Just put up the other one this Friday and call it a day. So you got to really know who's right for what job. So I'm going to go off of that and bring it back to the listener, the beginner. Be very purposeful about who you put into those seats when you delegate. Okay? If you want to do everything, by all means. But when you get to a certain point and your podcast is getting thousands of views and you want to scale, you're going to either need to study, you're going to need to, figure out better ways to do it, or you're going to have to find someone who that's their profession. And I'm going to say that if you run the podcast, if you consider yourself to be the person who runs the podcast, that's your responsibility. Okay. So, and I'm all over the place because to put it in other terms, like to put it in the terms of, general manager, this, that, and the third, I don't know it to be that. As I go along in my journey, I'll find out more on how, the top podcasts run, and we'll go that way because there's a podcast producer. Now, I kind of consider myself to be a podcast. I'm sorry. I consider myself to be a podcast producer in all that I learned. So when it comes to this, I like to have control over pretty much everything. When I say control, I mean, I like to have a hand in everything so I can know that it's being done to my liking. So if you consider yourself to be the podcast producer on your podcast, then your job is to make sure everybody else is doing their job along with your job. It is what it is. But if you're a part of a podcast and you have a job to do, then you need to make sure your job is done. Okay? I'll go over everything that has to be done with the podcast, at least on my side. Art on all sides, on all phases. That's your artwork for your audio podcast, your artwork for your video podcast, if you do one. Okay? And that includes all of it. That includes your thumbnails. That includes for your YouTube page. That includes pretty much anything that has to do with taking that logo and making it do whatever you need it to do. All of that art. Okay? There's the video editing and video uploads. There's clip creation. Okay? And clip uploads. Okay, there's audio engineering. Oh man, trying to remember everything. There is description writing, and all over the place. Description writing for your social media, description writing for each podcast, description writing for your podcast as a whole. What else? Oh man, I'm making it up as I go along because I'm just trying to pick it off the top of my head. There's a bunch of stuff, man. Stuff that you never even thought you would have had to do until you step up to it. Oh, there's, making sure the camera is situated the way it's supposed to be. Man, if I could say anything, I would say delegate. This is one of them podcasts. I'm sorry. This is kind of off the cuff. I would say just figure out how to delegate and get people who are professional to do it if you're willing to invest in your podcast. Okay? Just delegate. Get people who are professionals in that area. If you go to Fiverr, you can find pretty much whoever you need. Yeah, because I'm going off of just my experience, and I realize that. And with my experience, I want to learn how to do it all. And I'm not 100% on everything I do. It took me 3 episodes to get my camera to the point where I kind of like it on this podcast. But if I know what to describe to a cameraman or a videographer, he's going to dial those settings in and I can say yay or nay. So it kind of cuts the time out. Okay? A person who does artwork, instead of spending hours figuring out how they want things to go, how I want things to go, I can go to that the guy who does the artwork, and I can say, hey, I want it to look like this. He can send me a couple pictures and I can say yay, yay, nay, or nay, nay, yay. So you definitely want to figure out how to delegate when it comes to a team and put the right people on the team. So what I originally thought when I came up with this topic was knowing who's good for what job. That's really the base of it. But then I just started talking, and whatever came out. And I hope you got something from it. But every team is different. There are certain people who you know that they are the leaders of conversation on your podcast. They're the person who drives the conversation. Okay? There is nothing wrong with you taking a back seat to the person who is good at speaking or at driving a conversation and understanding how important that is in your podcasting journey. So once again, with the conversation I had with my friend earlier, he told me that when I did an interview with him on the podcast, Opinionated Podcast, he said every time he shows it to someone, he says, that's the leader of the podcast, referring to me. And he says, why do you say that? That's what he says, he says to the people. And they said, well, he's the guy that's driving the conversation. And I figured, and I knew I was, I'm going to be honest. As of late, I've kind of stepped back from that because I'm focusing on this podcast. And the reason why that's important when you're doing a podcast, having a person to drive the conversation, is if you have more than one person plus you're interviewing someone, your conversation can be stepped on. You don't want people to step on each other during this conversation, because as a listener, once you guys start stepping on each other, I'm probably not listening anymore. A perfect example of that is if you listen to Drink Champs, there's a lot of stepping on conversation. Now, there's nuances there, subtle nuances that, well, not really even subtle. There's nuances that make sense there. When you have a good interviewee, you'll fight through the uncomfortable listening experience just to get to that person's answer. And you'll come back if they have good guests. So a good guest is another way to kind of mitigate that. But as far as conversation flow, it is so important to have that when having your own podcast. So when you got guys falling all over each other, trying to get jokes in, trying to get, cutting each other off, not paying attention and not answering questions properly, you're going to have a mess and no one's going to listen to your podcast. Okay. But if you got a guy who understands, hey, let me stop you right there this way, using words that you understand as stop talking, so I can drive the conversation forward, that's gold. And you know to put that person in the driver's seat when you start recording. Because when you try to switch it around, which I've recently done, you get a very stop and go uncomfortable conversation where that person just doesn't understand or know how to read the room. Okay? So that's more of what I meant by choosing your team properly. You really got to know which person falls in the best category. One of the people in our podcast, there was kind of one job left. So we gave it to him. It's not that he fits it. It's just that, hey, it has to be done. Let me show you how to do it. Just do it like that. That's all I need you to do. And then that's how you take care of that. If you're the podcast producer, sometimes you got to show people how to do something and just expect them to do it exactly like that, because the talent isn't necessarily coursing through them, but they're a key member of the podcast in speaking form. You needed those three people. So you really want to find the best people for each job and then know how to delegate. So my advice to you, which I'll end this very scatterbrained podcast right here, is if you're starting your podcast, then you are your own podcast producer until you go get one that's professional, which means you wear all the hats, but you also have to properly delegate and understand the flow of the podcast. That is your job. If it's you and your friend and you are the brains behind it, you are the podcast producer. That means you wear every hat. That means if a person doesn't get an assignment in time, it's your job to hold them accountable and also make sure it gets done. I can't tell you how many times that I needed a certain thing by a certain time and it didn't get done and I made that person aware of it, but they're so slow, I just wind up doing it. You didn't load up the podcast in time. So that window that we have, which is every Tuesday morning, and I'm not dumping on my old podcast, I'm just going through a bunch of stuff that we went through over our 5 years. You didn't get that episode in enough time for our Tuesday release. I'm not going to wait for you. I'll just put everything in there, type it up, send it out. Boom, it's done. So rather than wait for you to text me back saying, oh, my bad, I forgot. No, it's done already. But hey, man, you missed this particular point here. I'm going to offer you a solution. The night before or the day before or right after we record or as soon as I get you the audio, why don't you set it for a timed release? That way you won't have to worry about waking up the morning of, typing up a description real quick and sending it out. That was my job. I have to be the guy who outthinks everybody and knows how to do everybody's job. For me, that comes naturally because that's just the person I am. I'll tell you another quick story. So for me, and these the guys I started a podcast with, they're my boys. They're my best friends for life. So this is not me, giving bad stories, but these are things that have happened over the years. Me and one of my friends used to make music together. We were a team. And when it comes down to being a team and making music together, it can go very well. And sometimes you guys can just be on two different planets. And a lot of times when there was something that needed to be done, I would request it. It'll get done, but it's just not done quite the way we need it. So I will put my, you just have to be the guy. If you start your podcast and you're running things, you got to be the guy that makes sure that all of your quality is to your liking. Okay? So whoever that is on your team, that's what they need to be in charge of. Make sure that they are the person that they are the quality control in your podcast, the producer, the person that makes sure everything, they know how to do everything on the team. So they make sure that everything is done right. And if it's not done, they're the person that does it. That might seem counterproductive, but when you get going and then you start missing your release dates and people start losing their trust in you and they stop listening, you're going to understand what I'm talking about. And by then it'll be too late. So stay up on your team, choose the right people for the right jobs. If I didn't get that across in this particular episode, I apologize, because to me it's a whole lot of things coming at once. But I hope that you can rewind this and find where I dropped the gems at, because it's a lot of them in there. You might just have to search for them a little bit. But just make sure you pick the right person for the right job, and whoever is the podcast producer on your team, make sure that person knows how to do everything on the team, everything that the team is doing, but also knows how to delegate which one goes where. So it's going to take some time, and you might need to hire somebody professionally if you choose to invest in your podcast. But this probably won't be the only time we talk about it. I'm still finding my way with this particular podcast, so it's a little sporadic. I still refuse to write things down because I feel like I won't be able to give it to you the best way I know how. So if you want me to talk about anything else, put it down in the comments. If you know anybody who is interested in starting their own podcast or their own content creation, or do any content creation or anything like what we're talking about here, share this with them. Share this with them. Okay? Because together we can help each other. So if you have anything you want me to talk about, put it down in the comments. All right? Remember to like, share, subscribe, and I'll hit you guys later.